All right, we are recording. All
Awesome.
right, after some technical difficulties, here we go. Robb Wolf, welcome to the World Class Dads podcast.
Huge honor to be here. In this day and age, I don't know if the internet going down is really technical difficulties. This is just life.
I know, unfortunately, it seems like a at least weekly occurrence, if not more, depending
Right.
on how often you're doing these video chats.
Absolutely.
And I do need to start off with a huge thank you. So you supplied me with a big box of Elements electrolyte drinks that I've just been downing with my workouts, and they're fantastic. So much appreciated for
Uh,
sending those over.
Like I mentioned before we rolled, it's like a good drug dealer where the first couple of them are free, and then you'll
Yeah,
you'll be selling your body on the street to pay for it in no
that's
time. So
right.
yeah.
That's right. And they actually came in handy too on New Year's Day after, winding things a little later. Well, as a dad, I think I've seen a new dad. I think I've seen midnight like 3 times outside of waking up in the middle of the
Right.
night during 2020. So yeah, staying up that late was not in agreement with my body. And so some electrolytes on the first were much needed.
Well, it's funny when we were putting together the company as specifically an electrolyte, solution. We weren't sure if it would really go. We felt like it would, was solving a pain point, but we formulated it so it would make a really good drink base. And
Mm-hmm.
so if it didn't go as an electrolyte, we were just going to kind of pivot, and it's like, here's your margarita base. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, yeah,
That's awesome. Well, I've actually used it too. Like I have a few different things. I'll kind of make my own pre-workout concoction, which tastes god awful because it doesn't have all the fillers and stuff that you get if you
right.
just get a pre-made one. And if I just put like a quarter of a packet of this into
Hmm.
it, it just completely takes the edge off it. So I've somewhat been using it as a drink base, but maybe not the what you guys had in mind at that point.
That's cool. That's cool. We like the innovation. That's awesome.
Um, so just to kind of kick things off, for those folks who are listening who haven't heard of you or come across your work before, would you mind just giving kind of a high level overview of who you are, some of the things that you've done, and what you're known for?
Sure, sure. I've been, I guess, in this kind of health and wellness space for over 22 years. I was by training a biochemist, and I was kind of on either a research track in autoimmune and cancer research, or potentially heading to medical school. And it was right around this time, it was 22 years ago, that I had been experiencing an ever progressing worsening of my health, mainly related to kind of GI issues. The long and short story of that is I developed a condition called ulcerative colitis, which within mainstream medical circles, the solutions are not great. You get put on corticosteroids, immunosuppressant drugs, and in my case, it was so severe that they were wanting to snip a big section of my GI tract out of me, my real estate that I definitely want to keep. And
Yeah.
I knew enough about health and medicine at that point that I knew that that was just kind of the beginning of what would be a lifelong downward spiral. And it was also right around that time that my mother, who had had similar health problems throughout all of her life, like as long as I could remember, my mom had just all kinds of wacky, what I understand now are basically autoimmune related issues and gut related issues, but it's just so all encompassing. Like there was neurological component, there was physical component, and then also the GI part. But uh, the idea of kind of an ancestral or paleo type diet got onto my radar back in 1998, and
And
I
sorry,
did
how
some.
how old were you at this
So
point?
I was like, so I'm going to be 49. So I was 27 then. So I'm going to
Okay.
be 49 here in a couple of weeks. So I was about 27, 28. And uh, at this time, like still on dial up. And then there was this brand spanking new search engine called Google, that into Google, I put this term paleolithic diet, and I found a little bit of stuff. And what was interesting is what I found really talked a lot about gut and autoimmune related issues potentially being caused by what we would call Neolithic foods, like these modern foods that come along with civilization. And it doesn't negatively affect everybody, but for a remarkable number of people, the folks in that anthropology paleo diet space were pretty made a compelling case that this
Hmm.
was a problem. So I really modified my diet. Right now, I'm probably about 160, 165 pounds. At the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was 130 pounds. And I
Wow.
mean, I was eating food constantly, but it was coming out the same way it went in. Like my gut was so damaged that I just couldn't absorb nutrients. My hair was falling out. My nails were split and falling out. Like I was an absolute disaster. And shifting to this kind of lower carb paleo type diet really was a miracle for me. Like it saved my life, and it caused me to pivot more into the research side of things. But it was only a year or two later that I was again poking around on the internet, and I found this weird workout called CrossFit. And it looked
Mhm.
pretty intriguing. I found it because it had a link to paleo diet research on their homepage, where they had posted this kind of ridiculous looking workout. So I told my friend Dave Warner, who is a retired Navy SEAL, about this website. And he was like, hey, this thing looks kind of cool. Why don't we check it out? And so we started working out in his garage gym. And before we knew it, maybe 3 weeks later, 4 weeks, or 3 to 4 months later, we had about 15 people training with us. And I reached out to Greg and Lauren Glassman, the founders of CrossFit, and said, hey, we really like this stuff. We would like to open a gym. We want to call it CrossFit. And they were basically like, go be achieved. Like there was no contract, there was no affiliate agreement, nothing, It was definitely the early stages of all that. And so I ended up co-founding the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world, and ended up
Wow.
working with CrossFit for a good number of years. And it was an interesting experience having both our own gym and also working with just tens of thousands of people around the world, because I got to see what things worked, what didn't.
Mm.
I continued, even though within CrossFit world, I guess many people kind of associate kind of like elite athletic performance with a lot of the folks that get into that. That's really cool, but I have always remained mainly interested in helping people who are sick or becoming sick to turn that around. Because
Mm.
if you've got some sort of like a just fire breathing great athlete, whether a male or a female, as a coach, I might tweak variables a little bit and make a little bit of a change, but they're going to be awesome
Mhm.
almost despite what I do. Whereas, like, if somebody has an autoimmune condition, some really bad GI issues, beginning to develop type 2 diabetes, changing their diet and lifestyle could literally save their life. And that has such dramatic knock on effects with their family and, just kind of their experience of life. So that's where I've always kind of focused, is more in this health and wellness space. I wrote, I guess, what was the book that kind of launched the paleo diet genre. My first book made New York Times bestseller, and then I've released a couple of other books that have made the bestseller list. And I could jabber on about some stuff, but that's kind of big brushstrokes. I'm definitely kind of a science geek, more in the health and wellness space. I'm married. I managed to rope a woman who is far too good for me to marry me. We call it the Chico State effect. Basically, there were 5 women for every 1 male at the university, and we have 2 daughters now, 8 and 6. And so, my primary job is raising my girls. Secondary job is being a husband, and then tertiary is still trying to help the world at large with these kind of health initiative type projects that we're working on.
I love that. And so girls at 8 and 6. So kind of where were you in that professional journey when you became a father, when kids started coming into the picture?
I guess you would make the case that I was reasonably well established. Like, I had written 1 New York Times bestseller. We had a little bit of success in some early stage investing. My wife was a co-founder in a technology startup. And all of that was good in that financially, we definitely were in pretty stable footing. The downside was that I was old. My wife was not as old as me, but she was in biological terms not a spring chicken either. And so it definitely made like the sleep deprivation and some things like
Mm.
that more challenging. It's kind of funny, like a dinner time at our house is funny because it seems like around 5 o'clock, our kids just get this second win and they spin up and like they're kind of crazy. And I just look at them sometimes. I'm like, you really drew the short card getting an old dad. Like, I just imagine them when they're 13 and 16 and I'm, another 5 or 10 years older, and just like, they're going to have a total buzzkill on that. But it is what it is. When I think about how I could manage sleep deprivation in my 20s, it would have been incredible to have kids then. But I think about how I was barely not living in my car during most of my 20s, trying to figure out what career path I was on and all that stuff. And it would have been it would have been kind of rough doing that, you know. So there's definitely pluses and minuses to when you get that family side of things started, you know. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I completely agree. There's no right time. I've had guests on who have made the argument kind of in both directions, or have at least had the experiences in both directions. And the thing that attracts me to invite folks on for being guests as world-class dads, are that they have had so much intention behind it. So like you said, there's pluses and minuses. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. There's just each individual's experience. And not to mention, I think you're probably a bit healthier and fitter than the average dad. So biologically, you probably got the young legs of a 35-year-old. So
I'm hoping
don't
so.
sell yourself short.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I heard you mention on another podcast I was listening to, getting ready for this conversation, that you thought you were busy before you had kids, and then you had kids and realized that your perception of time and busyness and priorities completely shifted. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how your idea of what time management and busyness, how that may have shifted or changed with kids?
Yeah, I was smoking crack before when I thought I was busy. Like I just had no. It's funny, and I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of like a different profession. Like if somebody's a doctor or a lawyer or something, you have this obligation that you need to be somewhere doing something. Like I do, but I also have had historically a fair amount of flexibility with my schedule. When I've wanted to write books in the past, you know, my wife and I would kind of reallocate time, you know, both on like cooking, shopping, maintaining our online presence and whatnot. So I could really kind of disengage from a lot of what was going on around me. But then when you throw kids in the mix, there is no disengagement. I mean,
Right.
there's minutes and maybe hours of disengagement, but there's not these just like huge tracks of time. And so uh, I want to say that I've become more time efficient, and I think that that's a fair assessment. I don't spend as much time as what I used to, just kind of like researching and free associating on stuff. Like I used to read, and I still do the best job I can, but I'm more in a skimming mode now. Like I read stuff in economics and chemistry and physics and anthropology, and I like to pull in a lot of different stuff, because if I've got a little bit of a unique superpower, it's kind of being able to synthesize material, like pull something from econ, biochemistry, and anthropology and put something together that's maybe interesting for people in a podcast or a blog or something. And just the 3 hours to synthesize is hard to find now. Like
Yeah.
it's got to be really you know, skinny end of the wedge. Like it's got to be real good ROI and whatnot. And so that's been a big difference. I still get that stuff done, but there's definitely not that just kind of like open-ended, you know, stretches of time to be able to think. But I will also say that in the past I was just horribly inefficient with my time. Like I screwed off a lot. You know, where I thought I was busy, it was because I was spending too much time on social media and things like that. And even though our business is still pretty tied to a social media presence, I have an assistant post everything now. Like I think one of the last people in this space with kind of the reach that I have that didn't farm it out. Like I really enjoyed interacting with people and answering questions and whatnot. And both the time drag and kind of the toxicity of social media, I have abandoned that. We have a private community called the Healthy Rebellion where I do put a fair amount of time into, but that was an interesting experience. Just simply stepping out of social media, one felt like being on vacation, because like this background level of stress and anxiety just evaporated. And I did discover that, like, oh wow, I'm probably frittering away a couple hours a day, you know, doing the scroll and all this stuff. And because we have an online presence, I would kind of justify that activity because it's like, well, this, maybe somebody's going to buy one of our courses, or they're going to, and I'm just serving people. Like I legitimately looked at it as part of my job to help serve people. But that current iteration of the social media environment, again, there's so much noise, there's so much kind of prickliness and toxicity and whatnot. I should have probably pulled the ripcord on that 2 years ago, but with, kind of reticent to do it. But that has been an interesting rediscovery of both some time and some creativity, because again, that I didn't realize it until I wasn't doing it, but my heart rate would start accelerating when I would go to log into my Instagram app, because I wasn't sure if it was going to be like a good interaction, or like somebody was going to be on there like lambasting me or something, and it was kind of like a 50-50 coin toss. So that has been something interesting that I had myself convinced that I really needed to be on social media a lot, because we have a media facing presence. That's how we do our business. But there are definitely ways to we still provide content, we still provide value on there, but there's not a lot of curation. And we just always mention, it's like, if you want to go deeper, go over to our community. And interestingly, the community is growing because I left social media. Like yeah.
Were you actually measuring your heart rate? Like did to come to that conclusion?
No, I could
you
just feel it. And my hands would start sweating. And, it's like, I mean, it was a legit stress response. And like, I noticed my sleep improved. I don't do a lot of tracking. Like I do a little bit of HRV every once in a while, but I noticed my sleep scores improved and whatnot. And just, I was a more pleasant person. Like I wasn't as big a dick to my wife and my kids. And, I mean, it was just this obvious improvement, both in my quality of life and also just my relationship to the world. Yeah.
I love that you mentioned that, because I think that a lot of the times we have discussions around social media, especially in kind of the dad world or the parenting world, about our kids, but we don't often enough turn the mirror around and look at ourselves and say, how is this impacting me and how I'm showing up each day? So that's really interesting. And I would say for me personally, I'd say one of my biggest challenges at this point. So my daughter's about a year. And one of the things that I catch myself doing, at least the most often, so the mistake that I'm most aware of currently, is that we might be crawling around on the floor, or she's playing with something and I'm sitting there, and I will subconsciously pull out my phone and be just looking at something, whether it's an email or flip open Instagram or something, not even thinking about it. And then either I catch myself and I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I have this time right now that is, I will never get back with her. And she's looking at me and learning behaviors from me. Or she'll even like crawl up and like grab me. And I'm like, wow, I am making a huge mistake if I continue down this path. So it's been something that I've been very consciously trying to get better at. And that's just like the one example of in the moment being with her, but that doesn't even take into account some of the
knock-on effects.
Exactly. And being addicted to your life and things like that. So I love
it's funny when you strip social media off your phone, it is an incredibly uninteresting device then.
Yeah.
Like and I've never dealt with email that much on the phone anyway. And so I really chunk those things. And I tend to do that later in the day after I'm smoked, because that's my like iceberg lettuce, low quality interaction for the most part, and do my more creative stuff early. But it's really interesting. That damn phone is so uninteresting if you don't have that addictive element of social media in it. And I would encourage people just like delete your apps for a day and just look at how you pick it up, and you're like, oh, there's nothing intriguing. Like you'll do squirrely things like check the weather, and then you'll add weather locations around the world just so you've got something to do. As we've literally been like Pavlovian trained to pick the damn thing up and fiddle with it. And now if we go do something, I grab my phone because it's still my main camera and all that type of stuff. But it's remarkable how important of a thing it was in my life and how comparatively unimportant it is now. And yeah. I
had Kevin Kelly, who's one of the co-founders of Wired Magazine, on the podcast. And you would expect, being a founder of a technology magazine, that he would be pretty plugged in. But his approach is that he just deleted social media from his phone altogether as well. And he'll still engage in social media, but only on his computer.
Yep.
And he said it's massively impacted the way that social media affects him, but also just kind of the time invested into it, and that gravitational pull, like you said, of your phone just
Yep.
kind of shrinks when you don't have that outlet on it. So
Yeah, and when you
I'm glad
hear
you brought
about
that
like
up.
these tech giants like Steve Jobs and some of these other people, and they were like, I would never let my kids use this
Right.
stuff, and I'm like, oh, well, there you go, you know. And I remember watching Narcos, the Netflix kind of docu series, and then also reading about Pablo Escobar, and somebody had asked him, would you ever let your children use cocaine? He's like, I would blister their backsides if they use cocaine. You know, what are you talking about? And it's like, okay, the guy that was a billionaire from selling drugs would not let his kids use drugs, and the guy
Yeah.
that's a billionaire from selling iPhones would not let his kids go near them. Maybe there's something like, there's not a lot of deep analysis there, but I'm not sure how deep the analysis needs to be. Like, I find that
Right.
kind of telling, you
Enough
know?
said. Yeah. If the
Yeah.
person who's most profiting and closest to these things, those folks are very hesitant. That new documentary just came out, The Social Dilemma. I don't know if you've seen that, but
That was really the thing that finally lit the fire, and both my wife and I were like, okay, this stuff's gone. Yeah.
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 Have your kids started getting into social media, or asking about it at all?
They ask about it, and we talk to them like you and I are talking. Like, we
Mm-hmm.
talk pretty high level, and we don't childize the conversation. If they don't understand terminology, then we explain it and hash it out. And the concession that we have right now, we are homeschooling, and we actually started homeschooling about a year before COVID, so we got really lucky in that. It worked well, everybody enjoys it. So when COVID hit, we you know, it really wasn't a huge disruption. They do have friends that at least do video games on say like tablets and iPhones and whatnot. And where we are now is if the kids are 100% on point with their homeschool, they do their piano, they do their chores, they feed the animals. They are outstanding students with the things that we're going to cover. No dragging their feet, no whining, no complaining. They eat their protein at breakfast, and I don't have to like arm wrestle them on it. If they do all that, then they'll get about 45 minutes they have a choice between Wildcraft, Minecraft, and then there's like a horsey and pony dress up game that
Mm.
I forget which one it is. None of these are networked. They're all only active on the phone. And so they're not able to like link up with friends. There's no like pedophilic stalkers that are
Yeah.
potentially interfacing with them. And we've had we continue to go back and forth. We do point out, so the kids go through cycles of this. They're allowed to do this, and then they make horrible decisions after being on the devices, and they're little shits. And we point that out to them, and we're like, you guys are horrible human beings right now. Like, these things make you crazy. And so it's going away for a month. And the interesting thing is, there's not even really like a tantrum thrown around that. They're usually like, I get it. Like, they totally get it. I'm like, do you see how you're talking to your sister? Do you see how
Yeah.
you're talking to your mom? And they're like, yeah, I get it. So that is the current thing that we do, because it is an amazing leverage on them. They really, really, really want to do it.
Yeah.
So we are able to kind of herd them through their must do's throughout the day, because they're highly
Sure.
motivated to do that. And I pull it at the drop of a dime. If they're not on point, like, I do not let one damn thing slide. You know, and as far as like disrespectful behavior, being crazy, and what I will do is offer them one correction. I'm like, hey, you are being a jerk, and if you continue it, this thing's gone. And I never, ever, ever don't follow up on that. I mean, never. If it's a two offense deal, and then I delineate what the consequences are, and it happens every single time. And I think that has been really powerful, and that our kids understand that there are consequences to their actions. We are super consistent with it, and they don't even try to like weasel their way around it, because they just know. But I've seen other parents where they get into these negotiation things, and it's exhausting. Like, it is totally exhausting, but it's more exhausting in my experience to get into these negotiation games and be inconsistent versus just being like absolutely on point every single time,
Yeah.
and communicating, not being willy-nilly about it, like being as crystal clear about what the expectations are, but also what the consequences are of not, following through with the expectations, and talking to them about like, well, how do you think you could do this better? Do we need to make oftentimes now I will ask them, do we need to make the iPhone go away for a little bit? And they're like, yeah, you do. So yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that you kind of draw the connection of, hey, you're acting like a jerk. You've been on this thing for, the last 45 minutes a day, the last week, and they can see that connection.
Yeah.
That is fascinating to me
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Well, and just, I don't want to moralize this, but I see a lot of people, even as adults, that are not good at drawing those connections within their own experience. And I
Yeah.
definitely see a lot of people who are completely divorced from the notion that their actions and even their thinking, what they're consuming, has consequences both for themselves and the world around them. And that's one thing that, like, if I, when I die, I hope that my kids have, figured out one of the things that I would like them to really figure out is that what we think, what we do has consequences both for ourselves and the world around you. Because then I think you can have a lot of agency in your life. You can make choices from like a I don't know, enlightened but an awake position. I love the movie and the book Dune, and there's
Yeah.
that scene where he
Yep.
puts his hand into the gom jabbar and it induces all this pain and everything. And really it's a test. Like an animal would pull its hand out because animals just react. And then a thinking, sentient being can understand that's all in my mind. It hurts like the dickens, but I'm not going to pull my hand out because I'm going to die if I do, and I parent via gom jabbar. Basically, it's like try to get the kids to understand that they can really have a ton of agency in life and really be the stewards of their own experience, but they've got to be aware of what's going on.
Yeah. No, Kelly Starrett mentioned Dune on this podcast as well, which encouraged
Yep.
me to go read it. So I'm fresh off my first reading of Dune. So I love that you bring it up.
Oh, awesome. Cool.
Earlier you mentioned that you see one of your superpowers being able to look at different areas and draw the connections and synthesize that into some sort of kind of actionable insight for your customers or consumers or listeners or whoever it might be. Have you seen that superpower, or have you been able to leverage that superpower with your kids or in parenting at all?
We talk about a lot of different things. Like I think,
Mm-hmm.
and I tell my kids constantly, I don't know everything. Adults don't know everything. The
Yeah,
government doesn't know everything. I remember as a kid, there was just
clearly.
this kind of sense that like, oh, well, there's something somewhere that makes everything work. And I don't know. I was maybe in my early 20s when I realized I'm like, this is all like a snowball rolling downhill. Like nobody's in charge of anything. This is
Right.
chaos, And so, I mean, I feel like I'm lucky in that I've got a good background in science. So like
Mm-hmm.
when the kids ask, why is the sky blue? I actually have a decent explanation around that, the diffraction of light and yeah, so we're able to talk about a lot of
Yeah.
different things, and then with things like the internet, if they have one girl came up the other day and she was like, "Dada, how many species of cats are there in the world?" I'm like, "That's a great search question. Let's go look at that." And we looked it up, and then the other one to know how many species of canines there were, and there's 37 feline and 34 canine, and so being and most people are savvy enough to look stuff up like that, but my wife's got a background in economics and speaks Spanish, Italian, and some Russian, and so she's very good in the language side of things and is good with math too. But we're able to just kind of talk and play on a lot of different topics, and I think that then that way for our girls, like if they have an interest in something, if we don't know it, we at least know somebody who does or some resource to
Right.
go do it. And I really have no ego attached to saying I know nothing about that. Let's go learn about it.
Yeah.
And
And what an awesome lesson in growth mindset too, to be able to
yep.
say, I don't know, but we can figure it out. We have the resources at our disposal. Let me show you how we can go figure it out.
Yeah. And when you think about like the modern economic and work world, like who's going to do anything for 30 years these days? I mean, maybe if you
Right.
become a doctor, maybe if you become a veterinarian or something like that, but oftentimes not even then, like these
Yeah. Things
things
are
that has
changing so quickly in those
so
professions,
quickly.
even.
Yeah. And so I think teaching kids to be critical thinkers and to have a love of learning and you know how to pursue that process of like analyzing data and whatnot. And so we talk about those things a fair amount. Like the girls would ask me, "What are you working on?" Well, I'm reading this paper about glucose and blood sugar, and I will give them kind of an overview of what it means, and then we'll do horsey rides. I mean, it's not all dry terrible stuff, but I don't know that I've really gotten to a spot where I can pull in economics, thermodynamics, and evolution and
Right.
have a conversation around them, but we can talk about all of those things. So like
Yeah.
a big thing that we do discuss is basically kind of like home economics. Like,
Mm.
is buying a new car a smart thing, and why or why not? And like if you really love a particular type of car, then okay, maybe you do that. But if you're just doing it for kind of like ego based reasons, you take that $50,000 car, $100,000 car, and drive it off the lot, and it just lost 30% of its value. Like you
Right.
just literally lit $30,000 on fire. Does that make sense? We were having that conversation this morning. My daughter was like, "I'm never going to buy anything but a used car," and I'm like, maybe not, but
Yeah.
do it with some awareness and not,
Right.
just because like the world is getting you all spun up that you've got to have the newest car, whatever. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Man, where were you when I was 23 years old? Damn.
I lived. I didn't learn I learned this the hard way, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the most of the lessons we'll be able to pass along are just licking our own wounds.
yeah, yeah.
So you're recognized as really one of the world's leading experts on a lot of things in the world of diet and health, and you've really put in the work and have the knowledge to back that up. How did when it comes to diet and eating with your kids, kind of what's your mindset or what's your approach in terms of what foods you're putting in front of them and the conversations you're having about food with them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a not easy thing. So I have celiac disease. So I have an
Mm.
autoimmune disease that's triggered by gluten exposure. So some people with this condition continue to eat gluten, and they live horrible lives, and they tend not to be that long, and they suffer a lot. And I really like steak, and although regular gluten French bread smells amazing, I can have a slice or two every once in a while of gluten-free French bread, and it's 98% as good, and that's just fine for me.
Yeah.
And both of our kids don't seem to be particularly gluten reactive, but we don't keep it in the house. If we
Hmm.
go to a birthday party or something like that and it pops up, then we don't sweat it too much. On a day-to-day basis, we just mainly put good options in front of the girls. There's always a type of protein: fish, chicken, beef, lamb. I mean, we really mix that up and try to have it as broad an experience as we can. Our youngest loves spicy food. She'll eat a half a jar of kimchi, just like out of the
Wow.
jar. And she'll eat sriracha and whatnot. The older one is actually more sane, and she'll have a little bit of spicy taco sauce and stuff like
Yeah.
that, but more reasonable. But the main kind of rule that I have is this speed bump process. I'll put a pretty good helping of protein on their plate, and they've got to finish that. Like they that's non-negotiable. Like you're going to
Hmm.
eat your protein. And I tell them every once in a while, I'm like, when you move out, you can eat or don't eat protein, but by God, you're going to get the best start that you can with
Yeah.
us. And then from there, if they want some rice, if they want a little bit of dessert, although we found some low carb ice creams called Rebel ice cream, which is pretty
Mm.
phenomenal, and the kids like it. And it's so interesting about that, if the kids eat the Rebel ice cream, they get a good sized bowl, they eat it, and I'm like, how was that? They're like, man, that was really good. They put it on the counter and they're done.
Mm.
If they get something like a Haagen-Dazs, they'll eat it and they're like, can I have more? And I
Interesting.
might give them a little bit more, and they're like, can I have more? And my second book, Wired to Eat, talks about the neuroregulation of appetite. And one of the things that I've used as kind of a bellwether for this is, does a particular food induce like addictive behavior? And like the really good, like a Haagen-Dazs ice cream, or even some things like a super good pizza or something like that. Like there's no off switch for the kids there. And so I will kind of intervene, but even in that scenario, I'm like, you got to eat your protein first. And, we're at a birthday party or something and they're having regular ice cream, and I won't really limit it, but I kind of load them up on the protein on the front end. And then I just kind of observe, and I notice that there's not really an off switch. There's no self-regulating the way that happens, like if we do like a low carb ice cream or something like that. And so that's just interesting to observe. My wife is much more carb tolerant than I am. She eats more carbs than I do. I've been kind of ketogenic for like 22 years. Neither of my kids are ketogenic, but we have definitely noticed that the younger kid, if she doesn't eat enough protein, and or if she eats too many carbs, she gets cranky later. Like she clearly has this blood sugar crash. Like she's usually really funny, really witty, and she just like her whole affect just closes in, and she is a viper and just kind of like attacks. And then you give her some food and she feels better, after that. So those are kind of the biggies. We've noticed that both of them, we can't do eggs every single day. They start getting some tummy problems with it. We can't do nuts of the same variety all the time. So we try to rotate foods a fair amount so that the, food sensitivities don't become an issue. We do supplement with about a teaspoon of fish oil every day, 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of vitamin D3 that has some K2 with it, and then a little bit of vitamin A, like a dropper form of vitamin A. And that's the only supplements that we do. And then both girls take a probiotic because it's watermelon flavored, and they smash it. And it's just kind of like, I just do it as kind of a backstop, just in case. Both of them seem to, they've never had like constipation. They get wonky bellies every once in a while and kind of go the other way, but it's very infrequent. Usually when they like eat a whole watermelon in a sitting. And
right.
Like, oh yeah, you're shitting like a goose. Who would have ever predicted that? So yeah. But I don't know, like that's kind of the broad brushstrokes. Like the big rule that I have is eat enough protein. And I'm 5'9", Nikki is 5'7", 5'8". So I'm average height. Nikki is a little bit above average height, and our girls are giants. Like they are at the 99th percentile in height and skinny as a rail, and they just smash food. They do Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, and they're really doing well at that. They're never going to be gymnasts because they're going to be too tall, but which is really it's interesting. And adequate nutrition, not everybody is going to be super tall, but height or stature is a pretty clear indicator of adequate nutrition in any organism. So like if an organism is malnourished, it will not be as large of stature versus if it had been raised in a well-nourished environment.
Interesting. So that actually starts to answer my next question. I was talking to my wife and mentioned that I was going to be chatting with you. And so what would you want to know about? And her question was, and part of this is we're very conscious of what foods we put in front of even our 1-year-old, but her question was, what impact does the food that you eat from a very young age, and as you're kind of in those preteen years, what impact does that have long-term on a person? And even thinking about like myself and all the garbage that I ate when I was probably, 5 years old, but how does that impact? I mean, absolutely. What you just said, the height is a good example, but are there any other things that the research points to that you know of?
Yeah, and this may be a little bit out there, so hopefully
I'm all about that.
This analogy makes sense. But a guy that I love, Brett Weinstein, he has the Dark Horse podcast. Absolutely love it. He's an evolutionary biologist, and he made the following case, and hopefully I represent it well. But he made the case that for children, there's a whole host of pharmaceuticals that might be helpful for different situations, but that doctors are really nervous to use them because kids are developing so incredibly rapidly. And if you alter genetic expression, it's kind of like if you've got a trip to go that's 100 miles, you would like to get as close to that end of the trip before you get any divergence, because
Right.
like, you know, if I have to get here and I start diverting here, I can divert way, like the vector has so long to grow.
Right.
It's almost like
One
compound
one
interest.
degree at the start, the starting point is going to put you way off.
Compound so much,
Yeah.
yes. And when you look at genes, gene expression and whatnot, things that happen very early have massive influence later. And we're now understanding that this has underpinnings in utero, you know, like the maternal hormonal and nutritional environment. Like moms that are uh, insulin resistant, their children tend to be more prone to insulin resistance and diabetes and a host of other problems, you know. So this stuff starts even in utero. So the earlier things happen with kids, it can have potentially longer and more significant knock-on, you know,
Mm.
kind of impacts. And part of this too, I want to put the following in here. People will freak. How often do you curse on the show?
All the time.
All time. People will
Every
freak
couple
the
of
fuck.
minutes.
I'll say these things and people will freak the fuck out over it.
Yeah.
Don't freak out. What has been done is done. So you can influence things deeply in the beginning, but as long as you are still alive, you can still influence it in a different direction too. So
Hmm.
don't freak out. If a mom is listening to this and she had gestational diabetes, the die is not cast. You can modify things, but you should pay attention to that. That's a data point that's really interesting, and you should maybe think about how you might steward the nutritional, you know, approach within your household. But
Hmm.
like as an example, so we know that adequate protein is one of these things that leads to increased stature, better teeth, better IQ, better immune response. I mean, it's just better, 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 better. And interestingly, at the end of life, when folks are old, higher protein is correlated with better health outcomes too. We're in this environment right now, particularly because of kind of this vegan plant-based influence that everybody is deriding protein, particularly animal-based proteins. And I think that this is going to be an absolute disaster going forward, both for kids and for older adults. But that's just kind of an aside. But as an example, kids who get adequate EPA and DHA, the long chain fats that we find in fish, for example, there's about a 10 point IQ difference in the kids
Wow.
that get adequate levels versus those who get inadequate levels. And one of the main, really the only dietary source, unless you're supplementing, is eating some sort of animal foods. Like standard meat will have some, fish has a lot more, particularly cold water fish and stuff like that. So adequate protein, getting enough types of fat in the diet so that the kids absorb fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin D. That's really, really important. And being a little bit aware of immunogenic foods. Like some kids do great on dairy and some kids do horribly on dairy. And the thing is that our society has gotten to the spot where kids having asthma and GI problems and hives and just all of the stuff. It's like, well, we'll run to the doctor and they put them on like Claritin or Singular or whatever. And it's, well, little Jimmy's just got this problem. It's like,
Hmm.
no, this is not a normal state of affairs. And again, putting little Jimmy on Claritin instead of addressing the nutritional problems, he's still growing and developing. And
Hmm.
antihistamines actually block the release of growth hormone during sleep. And this is going to have all kinds of knock-on effects. Now, if the kid's having he gets a bee sting and he's going to have an anaphylactic reaction, that's a different story versus like, well, as a parent, I know that he or she reacts to eggs or almonds or wheat or whatever, and it's just too hard to deal with that. So I'm going to put them on, even an over-the-counter med. I think that's kind of weak. I would recommend stronger parenting
Yeah.
than that, and I know it's hard, but I don't know if I'm 100% answering your question, but I
Yeah.
guess to kind of
Absolutely.
recap, like
You are.
protein, very important, good quality fats, very important for both those long chain fats. And we just give our girls, we do the Carlson's lemon flavored cod liver oil, or not cod liver oil, regular fish oil, and they love it. Like it tastes great. It doesn't taste like fish at all. We give them a teaspoon of that each night before bed. And then from there, we just generally try to have good food options around,
Yeah.
and stuff that is legitimately processed, like macaroni and cheese or pizza or something like that. That's like a once a week deal. Like
Yeah.
it is just not an everyday feature of our diet, you
So you
know.
still take a balanced approach, allow them those things, but just not
We do, but
frequently.
and we tell them it's like if you ate this every day, you wouldn't feel good, and you
Right.
wouldn't be as strong as jujitsu, and so and we're the parents, and so this is what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like, so we're just honest with them. And I've had some people criticize me. They're like, your kids are gonna have eating disorders, and I'm like, no, they're not. They're going to make decisions around what they want to do, because we have no emotional content around any of this stuff. It is just, if it, so like our oldest, we're certain that she reacts negatively to cheese. And ironically, the super low quality, like American cheese, she's fine with, and a good aged cheese she has problems with. And we think there may be kind of a histamine intolerance there. But we just talked to her about it. If we go somewhere and she really, really likes cheese, and we're like, if you want something, have it. But she gets this kind of like, like she clearing her throat. We're like, by all means, if you want to have it, but you're going to get the thing.
Right.
And she's like, okay. And she'll have some. And then we're driving home. She's like, and
yeah.
But we don't emotionalize it. I don't vilify her anyway. It's like, if you want to do it, but you understand that there's this consequence. And sometimes I might remind her, I'm like, hey, you're going to go play with your friends later. Do you want to be like hacking and sneezing and clearing your throat the whole time? And she's like, it's a good point. I'm good. I'm not going to have this cheese right now.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting how you draw those correlations and then just relate it to the impact it's going to have, like the effect it's going to have, not just kind of high level. You might feel crummy. You can show them, yeah, you're going to feel crummy, and here's why that matters in your life. Because when you feel crummy, you don't have as good of a time. Right. I love that approach. How early did you start supplementing with the fish oil and those supplements you mentioned?
Man, the fish oil, man, we started pretty early. Like we used a dropper. I mean, 6 months or something like that. Yeah, because the most rapid, other than in utero, the most rapid brain development in humans happens from birth to age 5. And so that is a prime time to get that going. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And you started to answer it too there in our conversation, but I also wanted to dive into that kind of emotional side of things and the relationship that kids grow up with having with food, the relationship they have with food as they grow up, and what impact the parent has on that and how they talk about it. Is there anything else? I mean, you did a pretty good job covering it, just talking through how you make the connection with the impact that those different foods might have. But is there anything else that comes to mind with that piece?
Yeah, it's tough, and some of this is going to piss some people off. Like they're not.
That's
all
right.
like it.
That's why we have you here.
Yeah. We don't use food as a reward at all. Like that's not entirely true. Like I had a book contract come in. I'm like, we're going out to dinner, but it was the same dinner that we always do. It's just we're going out as a family to celebrate that a book contract had happened. It wasn't hookers and cocaine on the table, like ice cream sundae. So we don't change that as a celebratory thing. The celebration is being together and having a good meal.
Yeah, it's the experience.
It's the experience, and so we don't have like special celebratory foods around Christmas. There's like some pies and stuff like that, and that's just part of Christmas time and everything. But we don't use food as a reward at all, and we don't use food as a punishment either. Like it's a non-emotional thing, and we do. Well, not constantly, but I mean, we talk about how some foods will make you stronger and better at jujitsu and rock climbing and all the things that the girls want to do. They're both into horseback riding, and I'm like, if you want to be good at that, then you need to be strong, so we do those things. And in my second book, Wired to Eat, I talk about this notion of having a good relationship to food. I think that that is one of the most dangerous things that people can cultivate, because it's kind of like calculating the last digit of pi. It never happens. Like, you never
Yeah.
get there. You know, it's this, in my opinion, kind of bullshit excuse where it's like, well, I'm working on this internal relationship with food. And it's like,
Hmm.
no, just make decisions that work for you. And you know, like my dad died at the age of 70. I ended up doing diabetic wound care on him his last 8 years of life, and it sucked. But maybe about 6 years before he died, like, I was haranguing him again about smoking and drinking and bad diet and everything. And he looked at me one day and he's like, can you not just accept me for who I am? And
Mm.
it hit me, you know. I was like, Dad, I know you're going to die, and I'm scared by that. And I want to have you around. And so this is why I'm pestering. He's like, I'm
Hmm.
going to die no matter what. And this is why I enjoy my life. Can you just accept me? And so that was a good point. Like, and if somebody wants to head down a particular path, then do it. But don't also then say, well, gee, I wish I could lose this 20 pounds. Oh man, if only my rheumatoid arthritis was better. Like, if you choose to do something, then accept the consequences and then live and be done. And so when I hear people say things like, well, I'm trying to change my relationship with food, it is a stalling tactic. It's
Hmm.
avoiding the reality that there are foods that have consequences. We eat, there are consequences, done. That is the totality of the story. And it sounds like I'm Vulcan and I'm unemotional, and I'm not. But when I see people head down that like emotionalizing food deal, it's a disaster. And they
Yeah.
usually don't get out of that quicksand ever. And so that is one thing that I hope that we have been careful as a family, not emotionalizing that food thing. And I tell my kids, I'm like, when you guys grow up and move out, you can eat whatever the hell you want, but you have
Hmm.
somebody who knows a lot about this. And I'm trying to set you up for success, and you will someday make all the decisions that you want to make. And you know, but like, you're going to be good at math, and like, you're going to be good at spelling and reading and writing. You're going to understand the basics of nutrition, and also they do self-defense. Like, they're either going to do Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu or a combination. My kids will know how to defend themselves, and that is just, I don't have many things that they will do, but those are a couple of the things that they
Hmm.
absolutely will do. And so I hope again that that doesn't set up any type of like neurotic behavior later, or what have you. And it might, but I don't think it will. And like, just from the feedback that I get from them, and they'll say, well, other people do this. I'm like, yeah, they absolutely do. And you know that if you eat pizza and macaroni and cheese 3 times in a row, how do you feel? And they're like garbage. I'm like, okay. So yeah, yeah.
No, I love your approach, and I think the thing that really differentiates it from some of what I've seen in the past is, and I've shared the story on the podcast. So sorry for those who are hearing this again, but we had a friend in the neighborhood who they were very strict about, what food was in the household, and you can't eat any junk food, period. And then she would go out, and when she had her driver's license, would go out, pick up fast food almost daily, go to a neighbor's house, a friend's house, eat it there, and then go home
Right.
and keep it under wraps. And I think the missing piece of the puzzle for that family was that they weren't having those open conversations of the educational piece of, here's why, and this is why we don't eat that, and that's why we don't have those things in our household. Because of how it makes you feel, because of the performance impacts. And it sounds like you have a more balanced approach with your family as well. But I think that being able to tie those actual impacts of what you're eating back to the family is what could avoid those type of situations where they do have those issues down the road.
Yeah, and you know, we have provided some opportunities for some good experiential learning. Like, it was a ridiculous setup here in Texas for Halloween. Like, people parked at a neighbor's house. They have like a 5-acre property, and we just parked, opened up the back of the cars, and then the kids trick or treated up and down the line of cars.
Oh yeah,
Our kids
trunk
had
or treat.
trunk or treat. They had like 20 pounds of candy apiece. I was
Yeah.
just like, oh my God, you know? And they were like, can we have whatever we want? I'm like, absolutely, go for it. And dude, they went face first into it. And it was maybe about an hour later, and they came and sat down and they're like, I'm so sick. And I'm like, well, do you want some more of that? And they're like, no, I don't, and it was maybe a week later, like, can I have a little bit? I'm like, you can have a piece. Like, if you do all your stuff, you pick one, you can have a piece. So we're not all or nothing on it, but I do, like, I just want them to get that there's consequences to stuff and not have emotional content. And it's like, hey, if you're just living and dying by having that baby Ruth, by all means have it. But, if it's going to give you a gut ache, or like that's the fourth or fifth one you've had in a row, maybe you don't have the fourth or fifth one. Maybe you go have a piece of protein first and then have it, so that there's a little bit of, metabolic balance there. So we definitely haven't taken like the all or nothing approach to this. At least I hope. And again, when I see opportunities for the kids to get some experiential learning and to internalize, like, oh, eating like as much candy as I can for 45 minutes sucks, whereas like having a piece here and there, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. No. Well, I'm super fascinated by this stuff, and I could tell that because we bumped right up against our our time here, and I don't want to go over. So, Robb, where can people find you, or do you have any resources or projects that you're working on that you want to share that people can go check out if they want to continue this conversation or just continue the education, learning about what you're putting out there?
Yeah. So my wife and I do a podcast called The Healthy Rebellion Radio. And so we answer questions like this all the time. It's like, oh, my wife was wondering, how would you feed the kids? That's The Healthy Rebellion Radio. We have an online community called The Healthy Rebellion. And you can find that at join.thehealthyrebellion.com. And then I spend a lot of time over at the Drink Element blog, and to the degree I'm on social media, I answer some questions over in that what is it? Just Drink Element, like on Instagram. I think it's kind of my main haunt there. So I'm one of the faceless voices that answers questions over on that. But we talk about everything on there, from like ketogenic diets to like race prep and all kinds of different things. Yeah.
Nice. Man. Well, we could go for hours on it. I will again give my endorsement behind the Element drink, because I'm drinking it now, and I do pretty much daily now. So yeah, you are
awesome.
a good drug dealer. You got me hooked. But it's really good stuff. So Robb, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on, man. This was an awesome chat.
Huge honor. Anytime I can talk something other than protein, carbs, fat is a nice day. So thank you.
We'll have to do a round two sometime in the future, because I know
I will bring down property values anytime. So thanks.
All right. Thanks, Robb. Appreciate you.